Well, hello, thinkers, and welcome back to another Patterns of Evidence episode. And we have Jodell Onstott. And Jodell, you were in one of our films, the Red Sea Miracle, and you're back again in this new film, The Israel Dilemma. And so why don't you give a little bit of background about yourself? I met you when you wrote the book, YHWH Exists. So we had a great conversation, and we used some of that to help us with the Israel Dilemma. But Jodell, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am primarily a researcher. My quest really began back in the late 90s when I had a crisis of faith. And from there, it prompted me to really stick and adhere to more of your atheist scholarship. And from there, just one thing led to the other. And I just fell in love with the research, and I tried to consume all that I could. That is what fell into the YHWH Exists Volume 1. And I dealt with chronology. I dealt with anything, the traditional things that are criticisms by atheist scholars. You know, this never happened, Israel never existed. And those were the things that I said, well, let me see for myself. I uncovered so many synchronisms that for me, I was convinced by the preponderance of the evidence. A lot of people, good-meaning, intentioned people, will say, you have to prove the biblical text. And unfortunately, that term is very misused because the only two sciences capable of proving anything are mathematics and logic. Everything else, whether you're medical science or astronomy, biblical studies, archaeology, every other science is always based on preponderance of the evidence.
Jodell, why don't we take a moment and show the trailer of Patterns of Evidence, The Israel Dilemma, Ancient Prophecies, so that people can see what this film is about. But your name shall be Abraham.
I also antagonized a lot of people by recognizing the state of Israel as soon as it was formed.
Where's your title to the land? He said, he held up the Bible and he said, here's the title. You don't lose your right to your home because somebody kicked you out.
The Torah came before the land. It's not by accident.
Patterns of Evidence Foundation presents
The covenants are what holds the storyline together.
a film that asks if God made a covenant with the children of Israel.
God's covenants are everlasting. There will be other things disappearing from the natural cosmos before I break my covenant. I will never break my covenant.
The God of Israel cares about all human beings, and therefore in the caring for Israel, he's expressing his love and concern for all humanity.
What evidence remains today?
Well, David is part of the history of early Israel, which has been maligned for some time because there was not solid archaeological evidence. That's all changed in the last decade.
Debate rages over the truth of biblical prophecy.
So they collect all these traditions, stories, myth, theological stories, and so on. We are dealing with the traditions.
The scriptures predict events hundreds, sometimes thousands of years off into the future, and they do so with a reliability that is breathtaking.
What will the pattern reveal?
If they break the covenant, there are consequences.
That's right. Before you get out of the Pentateuch, the whole basic plot line is there.
Patterns of Evidence, The Israel Dilemma. You had a chance to speak into this film and to be a part of this film, and you've been able to see it. A lot of people haven't seen it. So what's your reaction to the film?
I thought it was just very well done and very engaging as well. It really hits the highlights of all the information that is there. It hits the highlights of the available written inscriptions that verify and coincide with the scriptural text. So great job.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think for the first time, The Israel Dilemma, Ancient Prophecies is the beginning of a bringing some clarity for myself. I mean, when I make a film, it has to be simple enough so that I understand it, put it that way. And we started in the book of Genesis and worked our way through to this relationship. And that's one of the parts that you had was the covenant, talking about the covenant. What does the history of Israel tell us about the truth of the Bible? And I think the covenant is woven into that, right?
The covenant is really the foundation, because without the covenant, you have no guarantee. You have nothing on God that keeps him keeping his own word. In other words, without a covenant, which would have been a legal binding contract, God could say, okay, you've messed up too many times. This isn't worth my time, and I'm just going to go do something with another people, or I'm going to do this another way. But a binding contract is where you find a definition of truth. It's where truth begins. And what's interesting when I studied Israel's covenants was that covenants, especially with Abraham, they're given in succession. And one covenant, the stipulations, the promises, blessings, they always roll in to the next covenant. There's never a covenant in Israel's history where one covenant rescinds or contradicts the previous covenant. Rather, they keep building on each other. And that is really where you find the foundation.
I think that when we make these films, Patterns of Evidence, we're saying, well, what does the Bible say? And can we see evidence of that in history, either in archaeology or inscriptions in events of other countries? And that's what I found really amazing. There was so much evidence that was affirming the narrative. So the film is really about looking for evidence of a prophecy being fulfilled in history. And one of the steps that we cover in the film was that the prophets would warn the Israelites about breaking the covenant. There were consequences. The very first part of this investigation is looking for a kingdom. What did you find out about the kingdom? As Moses had prophesied that in the future they would become a kingdom. So did you find any evidence, or in your work, or as you looked at that they would become a kingdom?
Yes, what you find is that during especially King David, because during the Judges era, you do find some correspondences to Egyptian time in the land and their reigns of power versus Israelite. There's very much it waffles back and forth. But then as you come into the kingdom years, you find that there are administrative districts and administrative centers all over. And archaeology is really just beginning to uncover these. One of the inscriptions that we find that I may just mention is the Jodell Onstott, where it talks about judge righteously, defend the poor. These are almost things that you would find in the Bible itself. It's almost like a page of the Torah. But you find that with this, it shows that Israel had judges, it had an administrative center, it had people in place that were working under the king, and they were a kingdom. They weren't just some, this whole narrative where Israel was just this loosely organized tribal confederation that never developed into a kingdom. I think that is being debunked as archaeology uncovers more sites. And then the building complexes, that's the other thing. The building that it takes to do these administrative centers was vast. It couldn't just be done by a few people. It really shows they had an organized, skilled labor force that contributed to the buildings of many of the administrative cities.
Jodell, what you're bringing up here is there has been a great criticism against the Bible. And if the Bible isn't true, then, is God really acting in history? And what's interesting about your work is that you have gone through and looked at these evidences and said, wait a minute, what do we find here? And have you found that there are some archaeologists that are just not connecting? Because you're looking at evidence and you're seeing it connecting to the biblical narrative, but others aren't connecting it to the biblical narrative. What I'm trying to say to the audience is that there are oftentimes scholars who have just willfully been very dismissive of the Bible, and they are in some ways not even talking about a lot of the evidence and not actually talking about a pattern. I guess it's considered that this isn't true anymore and we can't support it in any way.
Then that's very true. Scholars, and I will say even some of the religious scholars, do indeed cherry pick the evidence. And I find that, when you're not honest with the evidence, or when you only take one passage of scripture and then you dismiss another passage rather than taking it as a whole and looking at a broader picture, you end up in a totally different place. But to my knowledge, when we take the written biblical text and we look at archaeology, some of the dates, like for instance, the destruction of the Migdol at Shechem, some of those dates, like archaeology, I think has it at 1085 versus at least the chronology I worked with had it at like 1080. So some of this is like spot on as far as dating. You have other things that scholars will just look over. Psalms 60 verse 1 has a superscription to it that talks about Joab going on a campaign when he confronted Edom. But when we look at history, we find that Adad-Nirari II actually had a campaign against the Arameans at the same time. So sometimes it's a fact, like what you showed in your very first patterns of evidence, that a lot of times scholars are looking in the wrong time period and they are putting things together and they're missing it, even though it states the name of a biblical king of Israel or Judah, but they're not making the connection because usually they're looking way too late rather than looking earlier where the history actually occurs. But there is a lot of just dismissing the text because even though there's a direct correlation, there's a synchronism, they just don't connect the dots.
Yes, and sometimes it's because the scholars themselves really don't know the Bible. Some of them don't know the Bible very well. It's not as if they've meditated on it, day and night, right? So I guess the point I'm making for the audience here is that I really appreciate what Jodell has done. She's really read a lot of different texts and then looked for the pattern. And one of those, when it comes to this covenant, so the covenant has, in this film, the Israel Dilemma, and if you want to get tickets for it, it's going to be on November 13th, 14th, and 17th in theaters nationwide, November 13th, 14th, and 17th. If you go to patternsofevidence.com, you can get tickets for this movie, The Israel Dilemma, and you can invite groups too. So that's a good thing to do. We're looking at 5 key points that happen. Moses told them that they would have a kingdom, that kingdom, if they broke the covenant, would be destroyed, that the people would be scattered, and then they would be persecuted, and they would return to the land. And that is the 5 steps that we're looking for. And is there any real evidence for this persecution? Do you see any evidence?
There is vast evidence. And one thing that I found that I think is so astounding, let's stick with, say, the deportations of Israel and Judah by Assyria and Babylon. We have a biblical record, both between Kings and Chronicles, Isaiah and Jeremiah, where they refer to those deportations. But the other thing that we have is we have Assyrian inscriptions that talk about those exact deportations. So it's not like it's just scripture talking about, oh, this is going to happen or this happened, but we have it confirmed in extra biblical sources. Tiglath-Pileser actually talks about deporting Naphtali, which is, of course, a biblical tribe. And Isaiah also speaks of Naphtali having gone through a horrific time. So there are a lot of these synchronisms that when you put it together, they totally add up. And when you look at Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26, it talks about these horrific times. And you find that there are times where, Israel, they're under siege. There's times where they even have to resort to cannibalism. And then you find that they are indeed deported to other nations. Nebuchadnezzar even tells us some of the cities where he relocated Israel's population. Everything that the prophets had prophesied, and this is the dilemma that scholars face, because you're looking for historicity. You are looking for accuracy of a text. So the trend now is that, everything is later. You had later scribes who wrote an earlier text. So scholarship dismisses prophecies. Prophecy does not exist when you go into academic scholarship, Because if it is a prophecy, say, of King Cyrus or King Koresh, all of those references in Isaiah and Ezra are usually termed to be very, very late additions because prophecy is not considered a legitimate form, but yet it is that very prophecy that shows us that the biblical text is accurate.
Part of what we're trying to say to the audience here is that is there a God who's acting in history? In your book, Yahweh Exists, saying yes, He exists, and how do we see it? Because we have text. God speaks through Isaiah, and He writes down that God says, "I'm going to tell you in advance what I'm going to do, and then I'm going to do it." And then you're going to look back and say, could any other God have done that except for this one true God? And that's what's happening right here. That's why this investigation, the Israel dilemma, is significant, because God is telling us in advance what He's going to do. And literally within the last 100 years, part of that, what He's telling us, I believe, was fulfilled. That's what this investigation is about, that God is keeping His words. What does this persecution tell us about the nature of God's covenant with the people of Israel?
Okay, several things. Number one, the covenant is conditional. Rather, the blessings of the covenant are conditional based on behavior. And when you abuse that, there's text in Jeremiah that says that Israel became even worse than the Canaanites that God had cast out of the land before them. And when a nation becomes reprobate, there's going to be persecution. And you find that this persecution occurred not just under Nebuchadnezzar with the deportations and the sieging of cities, but you find that it actually continued into the Second Temple period, where there were many, many wars against the Jews in the Holy Land during that time period. And you find that this persecution, you can see it throughout history. But there is always a direct correlation between keeping the covenant and having blessings, and then the times where departure for the covenant and there's curses. And a lot of times too, you find that there's famine sent on the land. Famine is one of God's tools. In Deuteronomy, what Moses would have written, it states that your heaven will be as brass, your earth is iron, because there would be no dew or rain or something like that. And you find that, with Elijah, those types of prophecies coincide. You can see them in history happening in the biblical text. And then archaeologically, you can also find them with the excavations and the layers regarding whether, there was agricultural produce or whether there was famine on the land.
Well, Jodell, we've got a lot to talk about yet. Why don't we come back for another program? We'll be back, thinkers. Keep on thinking.